and Jesus enters the dark arch opened in the thick wall. He passes silently before the guardroom, through the door of which comes the flickering light of an oil lamp, a common lamp, hanging from a hook of the low ceiling, and which allows one to see the bodies of soldiers sleeping on mats laid on the floor, all wrapped in their mantles, with their weapons beside them. Jesus is in town by now, and I lose sight of him while I watch two of the previous soldiers go back in, after watching to see whether Jesus had gone away, before waking the sleeping soldiers for the change. He can no longer be seen. I wonder what he meant by those words. I should have liked to know, says the younger one. You should have asked him. He does not despise us. He is the only Jew who does not look down on us and does not annoy us in any way, replies the other one, who is in full manhood. I did not dare. How could I, a peasant from Benevento, speak to a man who is said to be God? Just a pause there. I know people in Benevento. Maybe they're descendants of this soldier. Who knows? A god riding a donkey. Ha ha! If he were as drunk as Bacchus, he might do that. But he's not drunk. I don't think he even drinks honeyed wine. Don't you see how wan and lean he is? And yet the Hebrews, they do drink, although they pretend they don't. And inebriated with the strong wines of this land, and with their strong drinks, they have seen God in a man. Believe me, the gods are idle stories. Olympus is empty, and the earth has none. If they heard you, are you still childish to the extent of not being a candidate, and not knowing that Caesar himself does not believe in the gods? Neither do the pontifices, the augurs, the haruspices, the Arval brethren, the Vestal virgins, or anybody else. Why then, why the rites? Because people like them. They are useful to the priests, and Caesar avails himself of them to be obeyed, as if he were an earthly god held by the hand of the Olympian gods. But the first not to believe are those whom we venerate as ministers of the gods. I'm a Pyrrhonian. I've travelled around the world. I have had many experiences. My hair has become grey at my temples, and my way of thinking has matured. My personal code consists of 3 sentences. To love Rome, the only goddess, and the only certainty, to the extent of sacrificing my life for her. To believe nothing, because everything around us is an illusion, with the exception of our sacred immortal fatherland. We must doubt even ourselves, because it is not certain whether we live. Senses and reason are not sufficient to make us know for certain that we have succeeded in knowing the truth, and to live and to die are of the same value, because we do not know what it is to live and what it is to die, he says, affecting the philosophic scepticism of a superior mind. Just a pause for a moment. Interesting how they say that the priests and Caesar don't believe. In fact, Cardinal Ratzinger, as he was, I don't know whether it was when he was a cardinal, whether he was still not yet appointed to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and raised to the cardinalate, he wrote in one of his works, and I can't remember which one, that the intellectual elites of ancient Rome didn't believe in the gods. So that's confirmed here as well, and by this soldier anyway. It's also interesting to note that this particular Roman has a philosophy or an outlook on life. There are no gods, but there's Rome that's his only goddess. And that chimes with the modern ideologies of fascism and National Socialism. where there's just the fatherland and the state. And it was this sort of thing which was condemned by Pope Pius XI in Non abbiamo bisogno, 1936, aimed at Mussolini's fascism, and Mitbrennender Sorge, which I'm no doubt mispronouncing, of 1937, which had to be smuggled into Germany at Easter 1937, and speaking against Nazism. And the key point is, it's not just a question of racially dividing people into different types, different kinds of human beings, when the church teaches we're all one, but it's this sacralizing of the state. And this Roman is a version of this from antiquity. And we're not to do that. And in fact, of course, we can see it forced to ruin. Now, the 1,000-year Reich didn't last that long. And of course, Mussolini ended up hanging upside down with his mistress. But the point is that Rome itself, the fatherland in which this Roman believed, in the end, collapsed. The new Rome, Byzantium, went on for 1,000 years longer, but it too collapsed. All empires collapse. And it's the foolishness of us men that thinks that what is surrounding us is of great duration. Here I have a cup which celebrates the greatest country in the world. I know, Americans and others might disagree, but think about it. What empire, not even the Roman Empire, established nations all over the world that have thrived and where everybody wants to go. If it were not for Britain, there'd be no United States, no Canada, there'd be the French. They'd have an involvement, but it wouldn't be Canada as this wonderful country became. We wouldn't have Australia and New Zealand. And we, of course, we had the most prosperous parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Rhodesia as it was called, and South Africa. No matter what one thinks about them, they were massively prosperous, and black people lived under them in a far better condition than they have lived subsequently or prior to that. And all this, and I know the Dutch can claim an involvement in South Africa, just as the French can in Canada, but here we have the result of Britain spreading itself despite all the criminality that was involved in the British Empire, as in all empires. Nonetheless, that legacy of Britain is a legacy that no other empire has. And that doesn't even begin to talk about the great cultural enrichment of the British for the whole world. And it doesn't even go on to speak of the uniqueness of Britain as the first industrial nation. Now, I know the Catholic parts of Belgium did begin to develop industrialisation around the same time as Britain, but still, without Britain, there would have been no worldwide system that we have now of technology spreading everywhere. Of course, it perhaps would have happened eventually, but Britain made it happen when it happened. And so we can speak of the uniqueness of Britain, and without Britain, the modern world would not exist as it exists today. And that's separate from the problems that Britain brings. Britain is was the centre of finance of the entire world, and that was a system that was built which is not on Catholic principles. However, having said all of that, this fatherland is reduced to what you know today. It is not a pretty sight in many, many ways. 50 years before I was born, Britain was at the height of its power. Before the outbreak of World War I, it was the mightiest nation on earth, mightier than the United States. Now, don't get me wrong, the United States had surpassed Britain in industrial production in 1871. Germany had surpassed Britain in many ways, in many areas like chemicals, in the 1860s. But when you look at the overall position, massive industrial production, huge worldwide empire, massive financial power, the ability to command huge forces, so Indians, Africans, that could be enrolled in the British Armed Forces if Britain wished, and of course the most powerful navy on earth by far. All this was gone just 50 years later. when I was born. And Britain was a basket case, begging to join the European Economic Community, as it was then called. And General de Gaulle and others saying, no, probably thought, we're now a poodle of the United States. They don't want that. And a kind of potential subversive element within this new European power structure that was being built. But what matters is how rapidly a fatherland can be reduced, and how we must never put our faith in worldly things. And Americans need to know that right now, because they are on the same, I never thought they'd do this actually, but they're on the same trajectory as Britain. Will they escape war with China? Because as China and the United States are watching each other, and the United States is worried about the rise of China, so Britain was worried about the rise of Germany, and Churchill foolishly supported the war against Germany in 1914 when the cabinet was divided about this, to destroy the German industrial competitiveness to Britain. Big mistake. Will the United States go down the same road? Or will wiser heads prevail? Well, as at this point in the early 21st century, the heads in the United States are no wiser and perhaps more stupid than the British were. And that's partly because the heads of the United States are in their positions via the influence of the mass media, which just degrade the quality of politicians compared to the politicians we had at the height of British power, when it made its fateful decisions and fatal decisions to go to war against Germany on 2 occasions and brought us to ruin. So here we are. Don't rely on the Father. A long-winded way of saying, don't rely on earthly things. And in fact, in the Old Testament, God says this. Don't put your faith in the horse or the chariot, something like that, which Israel was doing when it went down to Egypt to fight the coming enemy from Assyria or Babylon. Rely on God. And now Britain, surely British Catholics can see, reduced to what we are as a nation, there's no way other than to turn to Christ. And if the nation doesn't turn to Christ, if it does pursue fantasies, then of course it's going to be completely destroyed. We can see the storm clouds of war anyway, and they may come no matter what because of the evils that are done in Britain, the absolute evils. We say that we look at the Kamala Harris platform, which is MAGA. Oh, it's a kind of MAGA. It's make abortion great again. That can only mean the ruin of that country. So the British, we don't have to have a platform. Abortion is institutionalised, but not just that. Lifestyles, shall we say, of intimacy are so odd and strange that are endorsed in our laws that we are turning further and further from God, and not actually turning from God now, but mocking God in the process. Disdaining Scripture, even if you read from Scripture in an English street, you've got a good chance of going to jail. Or you'll be hauled before a magistrate, or at least a copper will feel your collar. You'll be in trouble, as has happened. So that's where we are. So we know that the majority of Brits right now will not turn to God. They've turned away from God. So those who know the truth, who have a sense of what's coming down the line, we can't hope to avert the catastrophe that's coming, I don't think. We can hope to mitigate it. We can pray even for ourselves, and that at the end of it, the nation will come through. That the national territory will not be devastated. That there's a future for this island and the peoples of this island. But that's dependent upon faith in God. Not the Royal Air Force, not the Royal Navy, not the depleted British Army, or the depleted armed forces. Not the 2 aircraft carriers that a fortune's been spent on, but which are mothballed. None of that. It's all dependent on God now because we have pretty much nothing left. Everything's been mortgaged. Everything is borrowed. So let's go to God. If you're a Brit, but the same if you're of any other Christian people. That is a nation founded upon the Catholic faith. That is all the European nations, all the offshoots of the European nations. Particularly I was speaking of those offshoots of the British nation. We must all see where we are and what we must do now to, not to prosper, we might say, but to survive. And then perhaps after the catastrophe, after the axe falls, there'll still be nations to go forward in God's grace. So I shall resume this vision now. After that Roman, with his understandable but foolish speech, diverted me right off track. The other one looks at him doubtfully. He then says, I instead believe, and I should like to know, to learn from that man who has just gone by. He certainly knows the truth. Something strange emanates from him. It is like a light that penetrates you. May Aesculapius save you. You are ill. You came up to town from the valley only a short time ago. And those who make that journey and are not acclimatized to these surroundings become easily feverish. Your mind is wandering. Come, only warm wine with spices can make you sweat the poison of Jordan fever. And he pushes him towards the guardroom. But the other one frees himself, saying, I'm not ill. I don't want any warm, spiced wine. I want to watch over there, beyond the walls. He points at the inner side of the walls. And wait for the man who said he is Jesus. If you don't mind waiting, I'm going to wake up the men for the change. Goodbye. And he goes into the guardroom noisily, awaking his companions and shouting, Your time is up. Come on, you lazy idlers. I'm tired. He yawns noisily and curses because they've let the fire go out and they've drunk all the warm wine, so necessary to dry the Palestinian dew. The other one, the young legionary, leaning against the wall, illuminated lightly by the moon from the west, is waiting for Jesus to retrace his steps. The stars are watching over his hope.